that's okay with Kirtana. So, I mean, yes, I think there is a way to utilize nature-based solutions in a fair way, and actually, I think that is what we had with ecosystem-based approaches, which is a concept that I believe is defined by the CBD. That's the Convention on Biological Diversity, and the problem with this, as Kirtana said, is that so nature-based solutions, if I can recall correctly, it started to be used at the end of the 90s, but mainly on green building issues, infrastructure. And then in the early 2000s, it was put forward to address, so as an umbrella, as I said, for ecosystem-based approaches. I think those ecosystem-based approaches that are led and governed by communities and that are, of course, gender responsive are you know, a way to use or a nice, so to speak, nature-based solution. Now, my concern now is that this wasn't properly defined at the start, and I'm aware that now there are efforts to narrow or make define better nature-based solutions, but I'm not sure. I think it's perhaps a bit too late for that. That is something that should have been done earlier. So yeah, I'm not sure. Maybe I think you mentioned also something about reframing or yeah. So yeah, they are being mainly used at the moment, I think, or widely used to rebrand, as we said, false solutions and all the schemes that were already there and that they, you know, they've proven that to fail. So yeah, I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, maybe I can just come in because I think it's a really good question because I think there are several different levels of discussion to be had on this. So one is a strategic level, which is that, yes, of course, you're absolutely right. As I said, there are lots of things that, you know, communities on the ground have been doing for several hundreds of years. Mainly the ones that we promote as genuine solutions are community forest management and agroecology as a kind of catch-all for the many systems by which local communities manage their own territories for governance reasons, but et cetera, et cetera. And there's a lot of good evidence to show that that is in fact the best way of doing it, much better than protected areas, for example. So that's happening anyway. The question is, what do we want to call it? And do you want to bring it in? How do you want to bring it into the climate debate? And that is, I think, that's a different question because the work is happening anyway. So one thing is, you know, a strategic question, which is that with, especially in the UK, with the COP coming up, that, you know, everything points to the fact that the UK government and the corporations are positioning themselves to push this as like the big thing, you know, that's going to make them look really good. And in that sense, does it make sense for the UK climate movement to also be using that language in a different way? And that's a discussion I think that needs to be had. And I think there will be some organizations that do that anyway. But I think that's something that we need to think about for those who understand what the issues are at stake. The other aspect, which I just want to touch on, which I said at the end, is that a lot of these solutions that are community practice on the ground, they don't necessarily do it only as climate solutions. For them, it's their way of life. They do it for livelihood reasons, for, you know, for their culture, for their spirituality, to produce subsistence agriculture for themselves, for medicines. So there's also a problem about reducing everything to carbon metrics. And that's a huge problem. And so that is also something to be very wary of. And when we do talk about these as climate solutions, but we don't talk about them as carbon solutions. And that's the kind of, I think that's also something to think about.
Okay, so first on carbon offsets. So, I mean, we are completely opposed to carbon offsets. And there's been a debate about those for a long time that I don't want to go into. But from a purely climate science-based view, you know, we are now way above it. I mean, clearly, you know, we are way above the limit of sustaining a stable climate in terms of CO2 emissions. And, you know, and we are also in a situation where we can't stop all CO2 emissions entirely tomorrow or, you know, ideally yesterday. You know, we really need to stop emissions ASAP as quickly as possible, and we actually need to harness the solutions we have to absorb some of the carbon dioxide currently in the atmosphere. And the only proven way to do that is happening by nature, by existing ecosystems, by healthy soils, and by especially above all by mature forests. Now, so there is no scale for offsetting anything. You know, that even if it worked, it wouldn't get us to where we need to be. In terms of biochar, it's actually something that first myself and then my colleague Rachel Smoker in the US looked into at different times. So I did many years ago with Rachel, but Rachel did last year, looking at really detailed literature review. And I'm afraid there is no evidence that putting any type of charcoal char into soils can be relied upon to sequester any carbon whatsoever. In many cases, it can even lead to losses of soil carbon or have no effect at all. Same picture for soil fertility, and we are really, so the evidence does not back up the claims made about it, and we're really happy to share a literature review with anybody on email afterwards.
In the first place, I think it's great if more people start campaigning on aviation. I mean, actually in the UK, there's a lot more being done because of all the long Heathrow struggles, for example, than in many other countries, but still there's so much left to be done. And as Stay Grounded Network, what we are trying to do is to really share experiences between the different movements and NGOs and opposition groups, and try to learn from each other and support each other. So if you plan to do anything, then feel free to contact us or to become a member and get all the information we have in order to know what's to be done. But definitely, I think really, well, one thing that needs to be done is really busting those greenwashing myths and writing about why, and campaigning about why this doesn't work. It can also be done by ad busting and by different means. And the other thing is also to really start envisioning how a world with reduced aviation can look like. I think that's something we don't have in our heads yet. I think many people think that it's, well, and it is very core for this hyper-mobile, capitalist, globalized economic system we are in. So reducing aviation would really have big effects on global trade, on business, on mass tourism and quick relaxation for busy people, and well, but also a lot of positive impacts. And I think we have to tell more stories also about the positive changes that can be made when reducing aviation and the alternatives that exist there.
Yeah, so I mean, they are very interconnected, but I would say offsetting is a particular practice that some of the negative emissions technologies use. So the offsets are specifically when you use a scheme. It could be tree planting, but it could be carbon capture and storage. It could be, I mean, in the past, it's been awful. In the clean development mechanism, hydroelectric dams were considered offset projects. And then you can buy credits, so you offset your polluting activities in one place by projects, contributing to projects, mainly in the global south, but also now it's across the global north. So that's the offsetting part. Negative emissions. So negative emissions technologies are basically anything that is supposed to sequester carbon. So anything that draws down carbon from the atmosphere. So trees obviously do that. They would argue, Drax would argue that biofuel production does that. They did argue that previously. Also, for example, I'm trying to think of other things. peatland, obviously, but also storing carbon in soils. So now the discussion about agroecological agriculture practices is about basically how much you can keep carbon in soils, but also draw back down carbon in soils. So all that would be considered negative emissions technologies.
Yeah, I can start. So yeah, some of the real solutions that I can mention, I can quickly mention. I mean, of course, forest conservation and restoration. We barely talk about that. It seems that at the moment there is, and of course this is not an accident. A lot of the discourse around forest is around afforestation and reforestation rather than on forest conservation and restoration. And addressing, of course, the drivers of deforestation, the real drivers of deforestation, which is something that is often not done. I have to say, last COP in Madrid, I was in a high-level event on forest, and there were ministers from countries like Malaysia, Brazil, I mean, some of the countries with the highest rates of deforestation. None of them address any of the drivers of deforestation in their countries. They only kept talking about tree planting and tree planting. So anyway, addressing the drivers, I think it's also really important, and it's quite concrete or tangible to, of course, changing policies, but also stop giving incentives to some of these destructive corporations. Like, you can see this very easily in the agribusiness sector. And also we have to make governments to stick to their commitments, because, for instance, we have the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, and there is SDG 15, which is life on land, and target 15.2, if I can remember correctly, it actually has, as an objective, or is part of the target, to halt all deforestation by 2020, which of course is a target that hasn't been met. So we need also to just hold governments accountable to the commitments that they make. Those are some of the concrete actions that I can quickly put forward.
Sure. So I mean, just a bit, because I also mentioned this envisioning and positive narratives. So I guess for the nature-based stuff, you will have better ideas. But I also think that agroecology, for example, is a very great story to tell. And but for travel without planes, I think, well, in a climate just future, aviation would be operated in the confines of the planet's and countries' carbon budgets. So flights would be prioritized for those who really need them. So we will have discussions about which are bullshit flights and which are necessary flights. For example, for emergencies, for migrants visiting stricken family members on another continent or an island. If no alternatives exist, it might be still important, but for many others, it might be not important in order to really avoid climate breakdown. And it is possible to adapt quickly to a new normality. We saw that now in COVID-19, and we also saw it here in Europe, or in the global north, where people got used to quick city trips by plane, and just in the last 10 years, maybe 20 years. So it's something that can change quickly. Video conferencing has been used a lot during the pandemic and can continue. Decelerated lifestyles and work time arrangements, like a reduction in working hours, more flexible working hours, and chances to take sabbaticals could allow for people to take more time to travel and experience the journey and connect to locals. And there should be a range of comfortable and affordable climate-friendly travel modes like night trains, coaches, sailing and solar ships. And rail stations would be really convenient, have waiting rooms which are actually comfortable, with childcare being offered at associated play sites. And there would be regionalized circular economies that could allow for both the diversity of jobs and local goods, while real global connections will still be important, of course. So I think, they're just some of those visions maybe I have, and maybe you share them and want to tell them too. And for the concrete stuff to be done, just very concretely, I recommend you to maybe sign up to our monthly newsletters and therefore find out what you can concretely do for tackling aviation emissions. And right now, I think the window of opportunity is there to really enforce a just transition and really talk also to employees in the sector, engage in trade unions, and really try to use this moment where actually unemployment is rising in the aviation sector in a very unfair way to make clear that in order to have not another disaster and another degrowth by disaster, we need a good design now.
Yeah, I mean, I sort of made a little plug on our campaign on the biomass subsidies earlier, but in terms of solutions, I mean, I think, look, you know, having worked on biomass and bioenergy for many years now, you know, the main, I mean, my main observation is really that we need to be really, really careful of any type of large-scale techno-fixes. You know, one reason why governments are subsidized, one of the main reasons governments are subsidizing biomass is that it is seen as a quick fix to reach renewable energy targets, very, very focused on reaching targets, you know, because you can use the existing coal infrastructure and very similar infrastructure that you have for fossil fuels already, and just burn wood instead. And of course, we're seeing that this is really disastrous. So on the one hand, in Biofuelwatch, you know, yes, we would say that we have to absolutely switch to the lowest impact forms of renewables like wind and solar power. But I think we also need to be quite honest that we are really running into real massive problems of scale. You know, the idea that we can keep energy consumption at anything close to today's level globally and do it all on wind and solar, I think that is very, very naive and mistaken. I think, you know, there are impacts. They are smaller than those of biomass, but we absolutely need to scale down our energy use, especially in countries where, you know, which are consuming a lot more energy per capita than we really, really need, because, you know, because keeping in mind that there's still about 2 billion people in the world whose energy needs are not being met or only being met by really polluting domestic wood burning. So yeah, for me, you know, there's basically no way around restructuring and the social and economic changes to actually move towards low energy societies.
Yeah, I think just to say, I mean, in terms of putting forward ideas, you know, for what our solutions look like, I think we do have things that are good for people's well-being and, you know, in the round. So an example from which I've said a lot here, and also Magdalena said it, on agroecology, which is really a movement to completely change the way the food system is organized. So, you know, it is responsible for about 25% of emissions through lots of things, fertilizer, international trade, to really relocalize those systems. It's entirely possible to redistribute the way we use resources. And it has a very good impact on people's lives, things like pesticides and nutrition and access to nature, all these kinds of things. The other one I would say is from the more climate side or fossil fuel side is transport. And, you know, it's a huge win, and nothing's happening. It's kind of incredible that, you know, other than as status symbols, people don't like cars. They don't like traveling in cars. And, you know, I think that would be something that if you massively invest in proper public transport. So there are things that I think we could talk about, and several of those. And I think it's about building those visions. But the other thing I think that, you know, going into the future, especially with this conversation on false solutions, is really to change the narrative on where, because everybody now realizes, or, you know, thinks they know, the public knows that we're in, you know, some kind of climate emergency situation. But, you know, the other side is constantly pushing this vision that of individual responsibility and individual solutions and techno fixes. So that's basically it. You know, that's going to take care of it all. And there's a big job to do, I think, to change the public narrative, or keep pushing in the public narrative the fact that really it is corporations at the end of the day that benefit from the climate crisis. And a lot of the projects you see in the global south will have massive fossil fuel exploration to power mining projects, to then power ridiculous unnecessary consumption. And so there's a lot we can do if we didn't have the system that we currently live in. So that is what I would say.